47 years ago, a female university lecturer disappeared from her own home just a few days before entering the court session that would decide custody of her child, leaving 3 daughters to grow up believing their mother had heartlessly abandoned them. Police quickly suspected the ex-husband, but with no body, no direct witnesses, and insufficient evidence to bring charges, the case gradually sank into oblivion, like hundreds of other cold files. For decades, a man respected by the entire community continued to live peacefully with the image of a devoted father, while a terrible secret remained buried along with the fear and silence of his own family. Then, nearly 40 years later, when modern technology reopened evidence that seemed long dead, and an investigator decided to reread every page of the old file, just one overlooked detail caused the entire web of lies to begin collapsing in a way no one expected. Before we dive deep into this shocking case, please tell us where you are watching from. And if you love cold case stories, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss the next files. The summer of 1979 arrived in York, Pennsylvania, with long sunny days and the characteristic muggy air of the northeastern United States. Nestled beside the Susquehanna River and surrounded by cornfields, dairy farms, and long-established machine shops, York at that time was a quiet working-class city where most residents worked in factories, schools, or family businesses that had lasted for generations. On a small street in the eastern residential section of the city, 2-story houses with neatly trimmed lawns stood close together, and children often rode bicycles or played ball until the sun disappeared behind the rows of maples. The Whitaker family lived in a brick house built in the 1950s with a white-painted wooden fence and a small garden that was always carefully tended. From the outside, they looked no different from other middle-class families in York, but behind that door was a divorce that had dragged on for years, custody lawsuits that had never truly ended, and simmering conflicts that almost none of the neighbors knew about. On the afternoon of Monday, August 27, 1979, around 3:40, Paul Bennett drove his familiar brown Ford LTT up to the Whitaker house to pick up Emily, Eleanor Whitaker's 14-year-old youngest daughter, for a swimming practice at the YMCA in downtown. Eleanor herself had called the night before to confirm the appointment, even laughing that Emily would probably forget her goggles again as usual, so if the two of them were slow coming out, Paul should just honk. Yet, after 2 short honks, the front yard remained silent. No one stepped out of the door, and there was no sign of Emily hurrying down the steps, as she usually did. Paul turned off the engine, looked toward the house, and noticed that Eleanor's cream-colored Chevrolet Malibu was still parked neatly in the driveway. The living room curtains were pulled open on both sides. The upstairs windows were slightly ajar. Everything indicated that someone was still at home. He walked up onto the porch, knocked, then called out loudly for Eleanor and Emily, but only the late summer cicadas sounded in the hot air. When he tried placing his hand on the doorknob, Paul was startled to realize the front door was not fully locked. He gently pushed. The door opened just enough for a small gap when the family's golden-haired dog suddenly bolted outside in a panic, ran around the yard, then turned and barked continuously toward the house. Sensing something was wrong, Paul stood frozen on the threshold, not daring to step farther inside. From that position, he could see a dining chair tipped over on the kitchen floor, Eleanor's handbag still lying on the table next to a long cold cup of coffee, and a novel lying open face down as if the reader had only left a few minutes earlier. The stairwell light was still on, even though afternoon sunlight flooded the room. There were no footsteps, no voices, no Eleanor, no Emily either. Uncertain whether anyone else remained in the house, Paul decided to back outside, pull the door closed, then run next door to the Whitaker's neighbor. The moment misses. Ruth Miller opened the door. He hurriedly asked to use the landline telephone. His hands still trembling, Paul dialed the York Police Department, waited for the operator to connect, then said in an urgent voice that he was standing in front of Eleanor Whitaker's house. The door left open, the car still in the yard, but Eleanor and her 14-year-old daughter had vanished under highly unusual circumstances, and he believed the police needed to get there immediately. At exactly 4:02 p.m. on August 27, 1979, 2 patrol cars from the York City Police Department stopped in front of the house at 418 East Market Street. Lieutenant Thomas Callahan, 49 years old, an investigator with the Criminal Investigation Division, and more than 20 years of experience, stepped out of the car along with Sergeant Robert Hayes and Patrol Officer William Foster. Paul Bennett was still standing in the front yard, his face pale. "This is the house, Lieutenant. I only opened the door a little and immediately went to call the police. I didn't touch anything else," Paul said as Callahan approached. Callahan nodded, quickly noted the time in his notebook, then instructed his two colleagues. "Robert, secure the area. Bill, get the names of all the neighbors standing out on the street. No one is to enter until we've finished checking." After putting on rubber gloves, Callahan gently pushed open the front door that had been left only ajar. Inside, the house was completely silent. The wall clock in the living room still ticked steadily. The smell of cold coffee mixed with the scent of old wood created the feeling that the house was still lived in, only that its occupants had just vanished from the place. Callahan stood for a few seconds surveying the scene before signaling Hayes to photograph the scene with the unit's Polaroid SX70 camera. The chair in the dining room lay tipped over to one side, while Eleanor Whitaker's brown handbag still sat on the table next to a cold cup of coffee and the novel, The Thorn Birds, lying open face down about midway through the book. "If she was going somewhere, she wouldn't leave her purse behind," Hayes muttered. Callahan did not answer at once, but stepped over and opened the handbag. Inside were still a Pennsylvania driver's license in the name of Eleanor Marie Whitaker, $38 in cash, a checkbook, car keys, and office keys for York College of Pennsylvania. "Everything is still here," he said briefly, then asked Hayes to record each item. The search continued upstairs. Eleanor's bedroom was almost completely intact. The closet was still full. The large suitcase covered in dust sat on top of the wardrobe, with no sign that it had recently been taken down. On the nightstand was a bottle of ergotamine prescribed for Eleanor's migraines since the beginning of summer, next to an alarm clock showing 4:11 p.m. On the chair by the window, an outfit consisting of a cream-colored blouse, a navy skirt, and a light jacket hung neatly, as if the owner had prepared it for class the next morning. Callahan opened the dresser drawer and checked the passport, bank book, divorce papers, and documents related to the custody dispute over Emily. All remained untouched. No suicide note. No message for the children. No scrap of paper indicating that Eleanor intended to leave York. A woman leaving home would not leave all her identification papers behind, Callahan said to Foster, or she never had the chance to take them with her. As he turned to go back downstairs, Callahan suddenly stopped. On the wooden banister at waist height appeared a fresh scratch about 10 centimeters long. The white paint just peeled away to reveal the light-colored wood beneath. He bent down for a closer look and discovered that the corner of the stair runner had been pulled out of place. "Robert, come look at this." Hayes knelt, lifted the edge of the carpet, and said softly, "It looks like something heavy was dragged across." In the small closet under the stairs, Foster found a length of white nylon rope less than a meter long, the end cut very cleanly with a sharp object. Callahan carefully placed it into an evidence bag. Right on the third stair there was also a small reddish-brown spot, the size of a pencil tip. "Could be blood, could just be paint," Hayes observed. Callahan shook his head. "Whatever it is, it has to go for testing. We can't overlook anything." The three continued checking the back door. The door was only ajar, not locked, but the lock itself was completely intact, with no signs of forced entry. In the backyard, the ground was still damp from the rain the previous Sunday night. A few shoe prints and 2 faint tire tracks stretched out toward the alley behind the residential area could still be seen, but the rainwater had nearly obliterated the tread patterns. Foster shook his head regretfully. "If it hadn't rained last night, we might have had clearer tire tracks." Callahan stood still, looking at the traces drying under the sun. He could not yet conclude whether Eleanor Whitaker had been attacked right inside this house, or had left in a state of panic after an argument. But one thing troubled him more than anything else. Emily Whitaker, the 14-year-old girl, had also disappeared. "A mother might leave home," Callahan said slowly to Hayes, "but it is very rare for her to leave the car, money, papers, and vanish together with a young child without telling anyone." At 4:38, he returned to the radio in the patrol car and ordered, "This is Lieutenant Thomas Callahan. Issue a bolo throughout York County for Eleanor Whitaker, 46 years old, lecturer at York College, and Emily Whitaker, 14 years old. Check all hospitals, Greyhound bus stations, train stations, shelters, relatives, and close friends. Report immediately if there is any information. Less than 10 minutes later, while Callahan was still reviewing the crime scene diagram, the radio crackled. Dispatcher Nancy Brooks announced, "Lieutenant Callahan, we just received a long-distance call from State College. The caller identified herself as Laura Whitaker, the second daughter of Mrs. Eleanor. She says Emily is currently with her and is safe." Before 5 p.m. on August 27, 1979, Lieutenant Thomas Callahan returned to the temporary command vehicle set up in front of the Whitaker house when dispatcher Nancy Brooks transferred the long-distance call from State College to the telephone on his desk. On the other end was a still young female voice, trying to remain calm. "I am Laura Whitaker, daughter of Eleanor Whitaker," she said after a few seconds of silence. Callahan picked up his pen, looked at his watch, and noted the time as 4:49 p.m. "Miss Laura, this is Lieutenant Thomas Callahan of the York Police Department. The first thing I need to know is whether Emily is with you." Laura took a breath and answered at once, "Yes, Emily is here with me. She's safe." The answer gave Callahan some relief because at least the 14-year-old girl was no longer missing under unknown circumstances, but immediately a series of other questions arose. "Can you put Emily on the phone?" he asked. Laura replied that Emily was crying and had just dozed off after a long day, but affirmed that her younger sister was completely healthy. Callahan did not press and moved to the next question. "Please tell me from the beginning. When was the last time you saw your mother?" Laura hesitated a few seconds, then began to recount. According to her, on the afternoon of Saturday, August 25, she drove her Chevrolet Nova from State College to York to visit her mother and Emily before the new semester began. At first, everything proceeded normally, but sometime after dinner, the conversation quickly turned into an argument. Mother said I had taken father's side in the custody case over Emily. She said I no longer believed her, Laura recounted. Callahan asked, "What exactly did your mother say?" Laura answered quietly. She said, "You always choose your father, no matter what he has done." Then she started raising her voice. According to Laura, Eleanor lost her composure, continuously shouted, accused her daughter of betraying her, and frightened Emily so much that the girl could only sit crying in the living room. "Emily was very scared. She kept clinging to me," Laura said. "Then what happened next?" Callahan asked. Laura replied that near dawn on Sunday, after many hours of tension, she decided to take Emily out of the house to avoid the argument continuing. "When we left, Mother was still in the house. She was still alive." Callahan stopped writing. "Are you sure?" "Sure." "Where did you last see your mother?" "Upstairs. I only heard her close the bedroom door." Laura continued explaining that Eleanor had many times said she would leave York if she continued losing the legal battle with her ex-husband. Mother once said she wanted to disappear, wanted to start a new life somewhere. No one knew who she was. I think maybe this time she really did it. Callahan offered no comment on that hypothesis. He only asked, "If you believed your mother left on her own, why didn't you call the police as soon as you discovered she was missing?" Laura was silent for quite a while before answering. "I thought she just needed a few days to calm down." The answer caused Callahan to add a large question mark in his notebook. He requested, "Laura, right now I want you to take Emily to the nearest State College Borough Police Station. I want an officer to confirm the child is safe, and I need to speak with her directly." A little more than 30 minutes later, Emily Whitaker sat in the public reception room of the State College Police Station with a local officer beside her and held the receiver with both hands. Her voice trembled. "Hello, Emily, this is Lieutenant Callahan in York. Uncle just wants to ask a few questions, okay?" Emily answered softly. "Yes. Where did you sleep on Saturday night?" "I slept on the living room sofa." "Did you hear anything?" Emily recounted that in the middle of the night she heard her mother and Laura arguing very loudly upstairs. She could not make out every sentence, only remembered her mother crying continuously while Laura spoke in an urgent voice. "What happened after that?" "Laura came downstairs, woke me up, and said we had to leave right away. She said it wasn't safe here anymore." "Did you see your mother before leaving the house?" Emily shook her head reflexively, then remembered she was on the telephone. "No, I didn't see Mother. Sister Laura said Mother was upstairs in her room." "Did you see your father at the house that night?" Emily answered at once. "No, Uncle. I thought father was already in state college and would fly to California. This answer was underlined by Callahan in his notebook. After ending the call, he and Sergeant Robert Hayes began checking Laura's statement. They went to York College of Pennsylvania to meet the chair of the Humanities Department, Dr. Harold Benson, who had just seen Eleanor on Friday afternoon. Benson affirmed that Eleanor was very happy because she had just gained an advantage in the custody hearing for Emily and was preparing lesson plans for the fall semester. Her colleague, Professor Diane Foster, also recounted that the two had just had lunch together, and Eleanor had enthusiastically talked about repainting Emily's bedroom after the school year began. Attorney Margaret Keene confirmed she had an appointment with Eleanor on Monday morning to prepare the next step in the case against Richard Whittaker. Eleanor showed no sign of wanting to run away, Keene said firmly. She had just won the biggest advantage in years. There is no way she would simply disappear at this moment. The more the statements were compared, the more Thomas Callahan felt that Laura's story was missing important pieces. She said her mother had become angry for no reason, but everyone who had contact with Eleanor the previous week described her as calm, optimistic, and full of plans for the future. Before closing his notebook, Callahan picked up the telephone again and asked Laura one final question. "Laura, where is your father?" On the other end of the line, there was silence for a few seconds before she answered. "My father, Richard Whittaker, flew to California on Sunday morning. He is in San Jose for a job interview." On the morning of August 28, 1979, while investigators from the York Police Department continued examining Eleanor Whittaker's house and expanding the search throughout the county, Lieutenant Thomas Callahan received information that Richard Whittaker was no longer in Pennsylvania. At 9:17 a.m., California time, Callahan's call was transferred to the personnel office of an industrial equipment manufacturing company in San Jose, where Richard was attending the final interview round for a project management engineer position. Only a few minutes later, Richard picked up the telephone. His voice was calm to the point almost being cold. "Richard Whittaker speaking." Callahan introduced himself and then said briefly, "Mr. Whittaker, we need to inform you that your ex-wife, Mrs. Eleanor Whittaker, is currently missing." On the other end of the line, there was silence for a few seconds. "Is that so?" Richard replied in an even tone. "To be honest, I'm not particularly surprised." The answer caused Callahan to pause slightly. Most people who had just learned that the mother of their children had vanished reacted with panic or continuous questions, but Richard did not. "What do you mean by saying you're not surprised?" Callahan asked. Richard sighed. "Eleanor is a very unstable person. After the divorce, she often changed moods very quickly. She has said many times that she wanted to leave everything behind to start a new life. If this time she really did it, I'm not surprised either." Callahan wrote the answer down verbatim in his notebook and then moved to the more important part. "Please describe your schedule in detail starting from Saturday evening." Richard answered very coherently, almost without needing to think. He said that on the morning of Saturday, August 25, he drove his dark blue Ford station wagon from Lancaster to State College to help Laura move more things into her student apartment before the new semester began at Pennsylvania State University. Around 7:40 in the evening, he checked into the Nittany Lion Inn located on the campus. "I had dinner at the hotel restaurant and stayed there for the night," Richard said. "Did you leave the hotel during the night?" Callahan asked at once. "No," Richard answered decisively. "What about Sunday morning? Around 7:30, I met Laura and Emily for breakfast. After that, I drove to Harrisburg International Airport, left the car in long-term parking, and boarded an Allegheny Airlines flight to California for the interview on Monday morning." "Did you see Eleanor during that time?" "No. The last time I saw Eleanor was more than 2 weeks earlier at a custody hearing." Before ending the call, Callahan requested that Richard return to Pennsylvania as soon as he finished his business. Richard agreed without objection. "I'll take the earliest flight I can. After all, Eleanor is the mother of my children." 2 days later, on the afternoon of August 30, Richard Whittaker appeared in York. He came to police headquarters to give an official statement, still with the same calm demeanor as in the first telephone call. What drew Callahan's attention was not the content of the statement, but the fact that less than 24 hours after returning, Richard appeared at the York County Courthouse instead of joining the search for Eleanor. Attorney Margaret Keene, who represented Eleanor in the divorce, happened to see him walk into the court clerk's office around 10 a.m. on August 31. Later, she recounted to Callahan, "At the time, I thought he had come to ask about the search for Eleanor, but that wasn't it." According to Keene, Richard requested to see the employee in charge of family records to ask 3 questions. First, if Eleanor was not found for a long time, how would custody of Emily be resolved? Second, whether he could file a petition to temporarily suspend alimony obligations in the event Eleanor was declared missing. Third, who would manage the assets in Eleanor's name if she did not return. He asked those questions very calmly, Keene recounted. The woman had been missing less than 4 days, yet the first things he was concerned about were money and custody. I remember getting goosebumps. Those accounts caused Callahan to immediately request a full review of Richard Whittaker's financial records and divorce file. The results revealed a picture completely different from the image of a successful engineer he had always presented to everyone. Richard was carrying multiple personal and business loans, totaling more than $100,000 in the currency of that time in the case file. Each month, he still had to pay a substantial alimony amount to Eleanor according to the post-divorce court order. In addition, Eleanor was the insured party on a life insurance policy that Richard had not yet canceled after the two separated. More importantly, only 2 days before Eleanor disappeared, Judge Harold Simmons of the York County Court had just denied the petition to transfer custody of Emily from Eleanor to Richard because no grounds were found to prove that Eleanor was an unfit mother. That meant Richard had just failed in the goal he had pursued for many years. When all the information was compiled, Thomas Callahan had to acknowledge that Richard Whittaker had a very clear motive for wanting Eleanor to disappear from his life. At the same time, however, the statements about his travel schedule, the check-in record at the Nittany Lion Inn, the flight from Harrisburg to San Jose, and many other documents were creating an alibi that seemed very difficult to refute. In the following days, as the search for Eleanor Whittaker continued to expand throughout York County without yielding results, Lieutenant Thomas Callahan decided to shift the investigation toward the nearly 30-year marriage between Eleanor and Richard Whittaker. Together with Sergeant Robert Hayes, he successively met relatives, friends, colleagues, neighbors, and attorneys of both people in order to reconstruct the picture of the family that many York residents had always regarded as an ideal model. Photo albums taken from the living room of the Whittaker house told a story that seemed almost perfect. In a black and white photograph taken in 1953, Richard Whittaker, then a young engineer just graduated from Penn State University, stood beside Eleanor Carter in a simple wedding dress in front of First Presbyterian Church in downtown York. Subsequent photographs recorded the births of the 3 daughters, Susan, Laura, and Emily, summer vacations at Hershey Park, Christmas celebrations around a tree covered with gifts, and family picnics along the banks of the Susquehanna River. Richard was always dressed in a neat suit. Eleanor always smiled, and the 3 little girls always appeared with neatly combed hair and identical dresses. If you only looked at the photos, anyone would think they were the happiest family on the block, Mrs. Ruth Miller, the neighbor who had lived across the street for more than 15 years, told Callahan. Richard was a mechanical engineer holding a management position at York Corporation, while Eleanor taught English at York College of Pennsylvania. The 3 daughters all had good academic records and frequently achieved honor student status. The Whittaker family regularly attended Sunday services at First Presbyterian Church, contributed to charitable activities, and always appeared at community events. Everything resembled the model of the American middle class at the end of the 1970s. But when Callahan began asking deeper questions, the picture behind those photographs gradually changed. Professor Diane Foster, Eleanor's close colleague for more than 10 years, received the 2 investigators in her small office at York College. After a few minutes of silence, she pulled open a desk drawer, took out a photograph of Eleanor at a departmental gathering, and said softly, Eleanor smiled very beautifully, but only when Richard was not present. Diane recounted that for many years she had frequently witnessed Richard come to pick up his wife after teaching hours. He had never shouted at or beaten Eleanor in front of others. Instead, he used a soft but highly pressurized voice. Once Eleanor stayed chatting with us for another 10 minutes after a meeting. Richard stood out in the hallway, then walked in, smiled, and said, "Have you said enough yet? I don't think dinner is going to cook itself." Anyone hearing it would think it was a joke, but Eleanor immediately fell silent, gathered her things, and apologized to everyone like a child who had done something wrong. Diane also remembered one time Eleanor bought a new dress for Susan's graduation ceremony. The next day, she returned to the college with red, swollen eyes and said that Richard thought the dress was too expensive for someone who doesn't know how to manage money. Later, Eleanor confessed to Diane that every household expense was controlled by Richard. She had to request grocery money each week, keep receipts for every item, and explain if she spent beyond the amount Richard had set. "He didn't need to yell," Diane said. "He made Eleanor feel she was always the one in the wrong." When asked about the 3 daughters, Callahan received even more disturbing stories. Mrs. Ruth Miller remembered many times seeing Susan and Laura kneeling on the concrete pavement in front of the porch in the middle of summer. "I asked Eleanor what had happened, and she only smiled awkwardly and said the children were being punished for disobeying their father." Another neighbor, Mr. Frank Delaney, recounted that Richard required the children to stand facing the wall for hours if they did homework incorrectly or came home a few minutes late. "The kids were very well behaved, but they were always afraid of their father," he said. The moment Richard's car turned onto the street, all 3 of them would immediately run inside. In the interview with Callahan, Mrs. Helen Carter, Eleanor's mother, tearfully recounted that for a period of nearly 8 years, she had almost never been allowed to see her daughter. "I kept thinking Eleanor no longer wanted contact with the family," she said. After the divorce, the child finally confessed that Richard always threatened that if she opposed him or came to us, he would hire a lawyer and take all 3 children. According to Helen, it was precisely the fear of losing the children that caused Eleanor to cut off contact with her own parents for many years. After the marriage ended, nothing truly stopped. Attorney Margaret Keene brought to the investigation room a stack of files nearly 20 centimeters thick and placed it on the table in front of Callahan. "This is only a portion," she said. Callahan opened each file and saw that Richard Whittaker had continuously filed petitions with the York County Court for many years. There were petitions requesting a reduction in alimony. There were petitions alleging that Eleanor was psychologically unstable as a mother. There were petitions demanding that custody of Emily be transferred to him. There were petitions accusing Eleanor of deliberately obstructing the children's contact with their father. "I have practiced family law for more than 15 years, Margaret Keene said. "I have never seen an ex-husband file as many lawsuits as Richard. There were more than 30 files in just a few years. Every time he failed, he found another reason to bring Eleanor back to court. When the statements of Diane Foster, Helen Carter, Margaret Keene, and the neighbors were compiled, Thomas Callahan recognized a common point. Richard Whittaker was not merely disputing alimony or custody of Emily. He seemed to want to control every aspect of Eleanor's life, even after the marriage had ended. And if Eleanor were no longer present, Richard would not only escape the payments he had to make, but would also have the opportunity to erase her image completely from the lives of the 3 daughters. The investigator began to wonder whether this disappearance was merely the final point of a plan that had been prepared for many years. On the morning of August 29, 1979, when Eleanor Whittaker had been missing for nearly 2 days and still left no reliable trace, Lieutenant Thomas Callahan formally requested the launch of a large-scale search operation throughout York County. By 7:30 a.m., the parking lot behind York Police Department headquarters had gathered more than 50 people, including local police, Pennsylvania State Police, volunteer firefighters, search and rescue teams, and dozens of civilian volunteers. A large map of York County was spread across the hood of the command vehicle, where Callahan, together with Sergeant Robert Hayes and Lieutenant Daniel Pierce of the Pennsylvania State Police, divided the search areas. "We have to assume Mrs. Whittaker is still alive until we have evidence to the contrary," Callahan told everyone before the team set out. "Don't overlook any place." The first team headed toward the banks of the Susquehanna River near the town of Wrightsville, where there were many small boat docks and stretches of swift current. 2 rescue force motorboats swept along the riverbank while volunteers walked, checking every bush and patch of grass near the water. Another team entered Codorus State Park, searching the trails, campsites, dense woods, and Lake Marburg. The remaining teams divided up to check the rural roads around York, abandoned barns, old wells on farms, vacant lots, and many unused structures. At the same time, police contacted the Greyhound bus terminal in York, the Pennsylvania Railroad Station, Memorial Hospital, York Hospital emergency rooms, shelters for battered women, and every place Eleanor might have gone if she were still alive. Not a single location recorded her presence. Inside the city, hundreds of flyers bearing Eleanor Whitaker's photograph were distributed to stores, churches, gas stations, and supermarkets. The black and white photograph of Eleanor smiling was placed above the bold headline, "Missing Eleanor Whitaker, 46 years old." Below it was the York Police Department duty desk telephone number. Friends, colleagues at York College, and Eleanor's students also joined in distributing the flyers. Professor Diane Foster stood near the college gate almost the entire morning, handing out photographs while hoping someone would recognize the woman with whom she had worked for more than 10 years. While the field search continued, Callahan requested that Pennsylvania State Police tracking dogs be brought to the Whitaker house. Around 10:00 a.m., 2 German shepherds named Duke and Baron were taken into Eleanor's bedroom to take the scent from a jacket she usually wore. The handler removed the leashes and allowed Duke to follow the trail on his own. The dog moved slowly around the room, sniffing the edge of the bed, the chair, and the dressing table before leaving the bedroom. It went down the stairs very decisively, paused for a few seconds at the scratch mark on the banister, then continued toward the back door of the house. Duke crossed the small yard, followed the concrete walkway leading to the front, and walked to the end of the driveway where Eleanor's Chevrolet Malibu was still parked. There it circled several times and then stopped completely. The handler tried to encourage Duke to continue, but the dog only sniffed the pavement, turned its head in several directions, and finally sat down. Baron was brought in to repeat the process and produced almost identical results. "The scent ends here," the handler told Callahan. If she had walked away, the dogs would have been able to continue following. A sudden loss of the trail usually indicates the subject got into a vehicle. Callahan looked down at the asphalt in front of the house, then turned to Hayes. "That matches the tire tracks behind the house." Hayes nodded, but both men understood they still did not know whose vehicle it had been. That same afternoon, investigators continued knocking on every door along East Market Street in search of witnesses. Mrs. Ruth Miller, who lived across from the Whitaker family, reported that near midnight on Saturday, she had been awakened by the sound of an argument coming from Eleanor's house. "I couldn't make out what they were saying," she recounted. "But I'm certain there was a man's voice and a woman's voice." After that, everything went quiet very quickly. Callahan asked, "Did you see anyone leave the house?" Ruth shook her head. "I only pulled the curtain and looked outside for a moment, then went back to sleep." Another witness, Mr. Frank Delaney, who lived at the end of the alley behind the house, provided even more noteworthy information. He said that around 12:30 a.m. on Saturday night, while taking his dog outside, he saw a dark-colored station wagon parked behind the Whitaker house. "It was dark, so I couldn't tell the exact color," Delaney said. "It could have been dark blue or black. I also didn't see the license plate." "Did you see anyone near the vehicle?" Hayes asked. "I only saw the silhouettes of 2 people standing behind the car for a few minutes. Then I took the dog back inside. I didn't think it was anything unusual." This information was immediately cross-checked against Richard Whitaker's vehicle records. According to registration with the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation, Richard owned a 1976 dark blue Ford LTD Country Squire station wagon. However, in both of his statements, Richard had insisted the vehicle remained in State College throughout Saturday night and Sunday morning, with him at the Nittany Lion Inn. No witness had seen the license plate of the vehicle behind the Whitaker house, and no one was certain enough to confirm it was Richard's. But for Thomas Callahan, the fact that both tracking dogs lost the scent at the end of the driveway, the account of the midnight argument, and the appearance of a dark station wagon behind the house had begun to form a troubling hypothesis. If Eleanor Whitaker had not left York on her own, it was very possible she had been taken away by car during the night, before anyone realized she had vanished. By early September 1979, when the search for Eleanor Whitaker remained at a standstill, Lieutenant Thomas Callahan decided to concentrate all resources on checking every hour of the schedule Richard Whitaker had given the police. If he's telling the truth, we'll prove it. If he's lying, the lie has to leave a trace, Callahan said to Sergeant Robert Hayes as the two men spread a map of Pennsylvania across the work table. The starting point was State College. On the morning of September 4, the two investigators arrived at the Nittany Lion Inn, the hotel where Richard said he had spent the night before flying to California. The hotel manager, Mrs. Patricia Morgan, brought out the guest registration ledger. The handwritten entry under the name Richard Whitaker showed he had checked in at 7:42 p.m. on Saturday, August 25, 1979, into room 214. The signature matched documents Richard had signed in court and in the divorce file. He did come here, Patricia confirmed. Callahan then successively interviewed the staff who had worked that evening. Front desk clerk Susan Keller still remembered Richard because weekend occupancy had not been particularly high. He was wearing a brown jacket, metal-framed glasses, and only carried a small dark blue travel bag, Susan recounted. He asked about breakfast hours and then took the room key. Did you see him after that? Callahan asked. Susan thought for a few seconds and shook her head. No. After he went upstairs, I don't recall seeing him again during my entire shift. The two investigators continued checking the hotel restaurant receipts, but found no dinner charge under Richard's name. A waiter remembered seeing a man resembling Richard walk through the lobby around 8:30 p.m., but was not sure whether he had eaten. A more noteworthy detail emerged when Callahan requested the complete hotel activity records for the night. In 1979, the Nittany Lion Inn still used an internal telephone switchboard that logged long-distance calls from each room for billing. The accounting clerk confirmed that room 214 had made no calls whatsoever between approximately 9 p.m. Saturday and 6 a.m. Sunday. That fact alone did not prove Richard had left the hotel, but neither did it show he had remained in the room. Callahan asked further, was there a security guard or any staff member who patrolled the corridors after midnight? The hotel manager shook her head. Not regularly. We only had one front desk clerk on duty all night. That meant if Richard had left the hotel late at night and returned before dawn, it was entirely possible no one would have noticed. The two investigators then went down to inspect the parking lot. The lot behind the hotel was completely open, with no gate control, no cameras, and no staff monitoring it at night. No one recorded which cars came or went after dark, a maintenance worker said. Guests drove in and drove out on their own. Hayes looked at the wide courtyard and said quietly to Callahan, if he drove away from the hotel at midnight, nobody would know. Another detail quickly drew their attention. Mrs. Martha Collins, the housekeeper responsible for the second floor on Sunday morning, remembered room 214 quite clearly. The strange thing was that the bed showed almost no sign of having been used, she recounted. The blanket was only slightly wrinkled in one corner. The sheet was still very smooth. I even thought this guest must have slept very little or had just lain down and gotten up again. Callahan asked, are you certain? Martha nodded. I clean hundreds of rooms every month. I can tell a bed that's been slept in all night from one that's only been lain on for a few minutes. Of course, that still did not prove Richard had been absent all night, but it made his statement less solid than it had first appeared. Back in York, Callahan continued meeting with Laura Whitaker to recheck every detail. When asked what her father had done after checking into the hotel, Laura answered, Father helped me carry a few boxes up to the apartment first. After that, the two of us drove to the hotel. Father checked in and then walked out with me to the parking lot because I had left a box of books in the trunk. After that, he said he would go back and rest because he had to drive early the next morning. Did you actually see your father go back into the hotel? Callahan asked. Laura hesitated. Not exactly. I drove back to the apartment first. I only saw him standing beside his car. That answer left another gap in Richard's timeline. A few days later, a new lead appeared. Mr. Harold Jenkins, owner of an Exxon station near the road leading into Harrisburg International Airport, called the York Police Department after seeing Richard's photograph in the local newspaper. Jenkins recounted that around 2 a.m. on Sunday, he had sold gasoline to a middle-aged man driving a dark blue Ford station wagon. "I remember because it was very late, and there were almost no customers," Jenkins said. The man was wearing glasses and a brown jacket. He paid in cash and left very quickly. When Callahan showed him Richard's photograph, Jenkins looked at it for quite a while and then said, "I can't say 100%, but this person looks very much like the customer that night." According to 1979 road maps, the distance from State College to York was a little more than 90 miles. If someone had left around 9 p.m., it was entirely possible to reach York before midnight and then return to the Harrisburg or State College area before daylight. Callahan marked the time points on the map. In theory, the schedule was completely feasible. However, he still lacked the most important element. No witness had seen Richard at Eleanor's house on the night of the disappearance, and there was no physical evidence placing him in York at that time. The investigation had shaken the seemingly solid alibi of Richard Whittaker, but it was still not enough proof that he had actually left State College, driven more than 100 miles in the night, and appeared at the house on East Market Street when Eleanor Whittaker vanished. After the gaps in Richard Whittaker's schedule gradually appeared, Lieutenant Thomas Callahan decided to focus on the vehicle he believed might have been used on the night Eleanor disappeared. On September 6, 1979, with the consent of Richard and his attorney, investigators conducted a search of the 1976 dark blue Ford Ltd. Country Squire station wagon in the York Police Department parking lot. Sergeant Robert Hayes and crime scene technician Samuel Green began recording every detail. The exterior of the vehicle had been washed relatively clean, but when the wheels were removed for closer inspection, Green discovered patches of dried mud still lodged deep in the rear wheel wells. "It looks as if the vehicle had been driven on dirt or gravel roads before it was washed," Green observed. Mud samples were carefully scraped into evidence bags to be sent to the Pennsylvania State Police Crime Laboratory. When the rear cargo area was opened, Hayes discovered a very small cream-colored fabric fiber caught on the edge of the trunk liner. The fiber was less than 2 centimeters long, but was preserved intact with specialized tweezers. Directly beneath the rubber mat of the cargo area, Green further discovered a small reddish-brown stain, only about 1 centimeter in diameter, that had already dried. He scraped a sample with a knife and packaged it separately. In the tool compartment at the rear of the vehicle, there was also a length of white nylon rope, approximately 80 centimeters long, the end cut rather cleanly. Hayes immediately recalled the nylon rope recovered from the closet under the stairs at Eleanor's house. The two pieces of rope were photographed side by side for comparison. When examining the rear of the vehicle, Green also noticed that the metal frame holding the rear license plate was slightly bent inward, as if it had once absorbed a minor impact. "It could just be from backing into something," he said. But it's still worth noting, all the samples were transferred to the State Police Laboratory in Harrisburg. A few days later, the forensic report arrived on Callahan's desk. With the forensic science capabilities of 1979, the experts could only determine that the brown stain in the trunk was human blood of type A. There was no DNA technology to identify the person who had left the blood sample. Eleanor Whittaker did have type of blood according to York Hospital records, but Richard Whittaker, like millions of other Americans, could easily have the same blood type. The result, therefore, lacked individual identification value. The cream-colored fabric fiber was also compared with Eleanor's nightgown that remained in the bedroom. The report concluded that the color, fiber type, and material were similar, but it could not determine whether they shared the same origin. The two pieces of nylon rope were nearly the same size. However, that type of rope was commonly sold at building supply stores and therefore could not be considered linking evidence. The mud sample also yielded no promising results, because the soil composition was relatively common in many areas around York and Center County. When invited to explain, Richard Whittaker answered every question with his familiar calm demeanor. Regarding the fiber in the cargo area, he said, "Eleanor rode in that vehicle many times when we were still living together. If a few fibers were left behind, there's nothing unusual about it." Concerning the nylon rope, Richard explained, "I'm a mechanical engineer. I often keep rope, tools, and all kinds of materials in the car for work." When Hayes asked about the mud patches in the wheel wells, Richard shrugged. "I drive between Lancaster State College and various job sites. Dirt roads in Pennsylvania are everywhere." Finally, when Callahan placed the blood analysis report on the table and asked about the blood stain in the trunk, Richard glanced at it and answered at once. "A few weeks earlier, I cut my hand while changing a light bulb in the garage. Maybe when I was moving things, I got blood on the car mat." At that time, no scientific evidence was strong enough to refute that explanation. Meanwhile, Laura Whitaker continued to stand by her statement. She affirmed that her father had been in State College on Saturday evening, helped her move belongings, then stayed at the hotel before the two of them met again for Sunday breakfast. "I can't say what he did all night," Laura admitted in a supplemental interview. But the next morning, Father still appeared on time, as arranged. This very statement made the York County District Attorney's Office extremely cautious. After reviewing the entire file, Assistant District Attorney Daniel Mercer concluded that the existing evidence created only suspicion and had not yet reached the legal threshold for requesting an arrest warrant for Richard Whitaker. "We have motive, unexplained time gaps, and a few physical traces of uncertain origin," Mercer told Callahan. "But there is no witness placing Richard at the scene, no forensic evidence identifying the samples as belonging to Eleanor, and still no body. If we request a warrant at this point, the case is very likely to collapse." Callahan understood the prosecutor was correct, yet he still refused to give up. That evening, while reviewing the entire custody dispute file, he suddenly noticed a strange detail that no one had previously paid attention to. According to the York County Court calendar, 2 days before Eleanor disappeared, an important hearing related to custody of Emily had taken place. For many consecutive years, Richard Whitaker had never missed a single court session, large or small. Yet at this very hearing, the man who always arrived on time was absent and only sent his attorney to appear. Callahan closed the file, looked at Hayes, and said slowly, "I don't believe this is just a coincidence. The question is, where was Richard that day, and what was he preparing?" After many weeks of investigation without finding Eleanor Whitaker, Lieutenant Thomas Callahan decided to return to the place where every conflict between Richard and Eleanor had been recorded most completely, the files of the York County Court. On the afternoon of September 12, 1979, Attorney Margaret Keene brought to the investigation room 3 large file boxes containing all the documents she had kept over the many years she represented Eleanor. "If you want to understand why Eleanor disappeared, you have to understand how long this legal battle dragged on," she said as she placed the stack of papers on the table. Callahan and Sergeant Robert Hayes spent nearly the entire day reading every petition, every hearing transcript, and every sworn statement bearing Richard Whitaker's signature. They quickly realized that after the marriage ended, Richard had almost never accepted the court's rulings. Time after time, he filed petitions requesting reductions in alimony, seeking changes in custody of Emily, accusing Eleanor of deliberately alienating the children's affection for their father, or claiming she was not stable enough to continue caring for their daughter. "In the past 6 years, I have counted more than 30 different petitions," Margaret Keene said. "Some files were only a few weeks apart. Every time he was denied, Richard found another reason to bring Eleanor back to court." What most drew Callahan's attention was an unusual detail. Throughout all the transcripts, Richard had personally appeared at almost every hearing. Whether it rained, snowed, or he had to drive dozens of miles, he always arrived on time, took careful notes, and spoke proactively before the judge. "He never missed a single session," Margaret affirmed, until the hearing on August 23. That was the hearing in which Richard requested that custody of Emily be transferred to him and continued to seek a reduction in alimony obligations. However, that morning Richard did not appear. Only his attorney attended and requested permission to present on behalf of the client. After reviewing all the evidence, Judge Harold Simmons denied every one of Richard's requests and left custody of Emily with Eleanor. Margaret still remembered her client's reaction after the hearing very clearly. "Eleanor walked out of the courtroom with a smile I hadn't seen in many years," she recounted. "She said it was the first time she felt justice was truly on her side." Then Margaret opened her briefcase and took out a carefully folded white envelope. This is the letter Eleanor sent me that evening. I think you should read it." Callahan gently opened the handwritten letter in blue ink. In the letter, Eleanor thanked Margaret for having persevered alongside her through so many years of litigation. One passage that especially caught Callahan's attention read, "For the first time in many years, I feel I can begin life again. I no longer want to live in fear." Eleanor continued sharing her plans after the case ended. She hoped to retain custody of Emily until her daughter reached adulthood, then sell the house on East Market Street and move closer to York College. She also planned to continue teaching full-time in the fall semester, complete the new curriculum she had just prepared, and what moved Margaret most, to reconnect with her own parents after many years of separation. "She even asked me whether she should invite her parents to dinner at Thanksgiving," Margaret recalled. Eleanor said it was time for the family to be healed. Callahan set the letter down on the table very slowly. The woman who had written those lines was clearly preparing for the future, not for a voluntary disappearance. Only 2 days later, Eleanor Whitaker completely vanished from everyone's life without taking clothes, money, or any of the plans she had written in the letter. When the timeline was compared, Callahan began considering a new hypothesis. If Richard knew he was going to lose the hearing, he said to Hayes, his absence from court may not have been a coincidence. Hayes looked up at the calendar on the wall. "You mean he deliberately stayed away?" Callahan nodded. If Richard appeared at every hearing for many years, yet on the most important one he was somewhere else, perhaps he wanted Eleanor to believe the war was over. When the opponent thinks she has won and begins to let her guard down, that can also be the most dangerous moment. That hypothesis sent the investigators back to re-examine Richard's entire financial file. The numbers made the picture even clearer. Besides debts totaling more than $100,000, Richard still had to pay monthly alimony according to the court order. Bank records showed many loans past due, while his income was no longer sufficient to cover all his financial obligations. According to Callahan's analysis, if Eleanor were declared dead under the law after a certain period, Richard's alimony obligation would end, and at the same time he would have the opportunity to request custody of Emily and resolve many outstanding property issues. The financial motive therefore became increasingly apparent. But then Callahan closed the file again with a contemplative expression. "That's only motive," he said. "To charge someone with murder, we have to prove Eleanor is dead. And up to this moment," he looked at the search map covered with red pins on the wall, "we still don't have a body." Autumn of 1979 gradually gave way to winter, but the investigation into the disappearance of Eleanor Whitaker still had not moved any closer to an answer. Lieutenant Thomas Callahan refused to close the file, even though many people were beginning to believe the case would soon reach a dead end. "As long as we haven't found Eleanor, we still have work to do," he often said during the morning briefings at the York Police Department. In the months that followed, the investigative team launched dozens of additional search operations based on the smallest leads. The Pennsylvania State Police dive team repeatedly scoured sections of the Susquehanna River near Wrightsville, using grappling hooks and motorboats to examine deep water areas, sandbars, and stretches of slow current where a body might become snagged. Each time the divers surfaced from the freezing water, the results were only rotting branches, old tires, and river debris. There was no trace of Eleanor. The search was then expanded to abandoned quarries around York County and deep water holes on old farms. Police used small boats, sounding lines, and diving equipment to check every location considered a possible disposal site. All of them yielded nothing. In November 1979, an anonymous call reported that Eleanor's body might have been buried in a vacant lot near Codorus Township. Callahan immediately obtained a search warrant. The next morning, a bulldozer and investigators dug almost the entire indicated area for several hours. When the excavation reached more than a meter deep, they found only rotting wood, animal bones, and old household trash. The tip was completely false. Parallel with the field searches, Sergeant Robert Hayes was responsible for reviewing every file of unidentified women recovered in Pennsylvania and the neighboring states of Maryland, New Jersey, Delaware, Ohio, and New York. Whenever an unidentified female body was found, Callahan required comparisons of height, age, dental records, blood type, and identifying features with those of Eleanor Whitaker. Time after time, the results eliminated the possibility that the victim was Eleanor. Police also sent her photograph to hospitals, morgues, and law enforcement agencies throughout the northeastern United States. No location confirmed ever having received a woman matching her description. Another hypothesis considered was that Eleanor might still be alive but suffering from amnesia or a psychological crisis. Under Callahan's direction, investigators checked admission records at numerous psychiatric hospitals and mental health facilities in Pennsylvania. They cross-referenced names, photographs, and descriptions of hundreds of women admitted in the months after Eleanor disappeared. Not a single case matched. Meanwhile, the York Police Department hotline continually received calls from people across the region. A truck driver insisted he had seen Eleanor working as a waitress in Philadelphia. A woman in Baltimore said she had met Eleanor in a department store. A couple in Pittsburgh were certain the woman sitting alone in a coffee shop was Eleanor Whitaker. Every report was verified by personnel assigned by Callahan. Every verification led to the same result: mistaken identity. In January 1980, a woman named Martha Ellis called from Harrisburg and said that approximately 2 days after Eleanor disappeared, she had seen a woman who strongly resembled Eleanor board long-distance Greyhound bus. Hayes personally went to meet Martha. After viewing several different photographs, she could only say, "I think it's this person, but I'm not sure." Greyhound passenger lists at that time did not require identification, so police could not verify who the woman Martha had seen actually was. That final lead also quickly reached a dead end. Not long afterward, a fisherman discovered a woman's scarf caught on a bush along the Susquehanna River and reported it to police. For a few hours, the entire investigative team hoped this might be the first physical evidence belonging to Eleanor. However, after Margaret Keene and the daughters examined it, they all confirmed the scarf did not belong to her. Laboratory analysis also found no traces linked to Eleanor Whitaker. As time passed, the silence surrounding the case began to generate countless rumors within the York community. Some people believed Eleanor had grown too weary of the years of litigation and had decided to leave, change her name, and start a new life somewhere else. Others were certain Richard Whitaker had caused his ex-wife to disappear and were only waiting for the day police found the body. Coffee shops, churches, and supermarkets throughout the city became venues for debates about Eleanor's fate. Richard made no effort to avoid public opinion. In a brief interview with the York Daily Record, he declared, "I believe Eleanor left on her own. She abandoned everyone, including Emily. That was her decision, not mine." The statement outraged many people, yet for the investigators, emotion could not replace evidence. Thomas Callahan still believed Eleanor had not voluntarily disappeared, but after many months of investigation, searches, and verification of hundreds of leads, he still lacked evidence strong enough to publicly refute Richard Whitaker's assertion or to move the case forward another step. By the end of the summer of 1980, nearly a year after Eleanor Whitaker disappeared, the York Police Department investigation was forced to scale back. Thousands of man-hours, hundreds of interviews, and multiple wide-area searches had not produced the answer Lieutenant Thomas Callahan had hoped for. Investigators continued to accept every new tip, but the dedicated task force was no longer maintained at the level of the first months. At the Case Syre meeting held on the morning of August 21, 1980, at York Police Headquarters, Callahan stood a large board covered with crime scene photographs, maps, and notes that had faded with time. He looked at each investigator in the room and said, "After nearly 12 months, we are left with only 3 possibilities." He took a marker and wrote on the board. Possibility 1. Eleanor Whitaker voluntarily left her old life and started over somewhere else. Hayes immediately shook his head. No bank transactions, no employment applications, no new driver's license, or any other administrative trace had ever appeared after the day Eleanor vanished. A woman who was planning for the new semester, preparing to sell her house, and reconciling with her parents had almost no rational reason to abandon everything without contacting her 3 daughters. Callahan drew a line under the first hypothesis and continued. Possibility 2, Eleanor met with an accident or committed suicide. In nearly a year, police had checked hospitals, morgues, rivers, streams, lakes, quarries, old wells, and dozens of remote areas. They had also compared every unidentified female body recovered in Pennsylvania and several neighboring states. Not a single result matched Eleanor. If it were an accident or suicide, Callahan said, we should have found her long ago. Finally, he circled the third hypothesis. Richard Whittaker murdered Eleanor and concealed the body. The room fell silent. This was the hypothesis almost every investigator on the team suspected most strongly. Richard had a clear financial motive, had just lost the custody case involving Emily, had unexplained gaps in his timeline on the night Eleanor disappeared, and his vehicle contained several suspicious traces. Nevertheless, Callahan also had to acknowledge the factor that prevented the case from advancing. We still lack the decisive link, he said slowly. There is no witness who saw Richard at Eleanor's house. There is no body. There is no forensic evidence strong enough to take the case to court. That very gap kept all the suspicion at the level of investigative hypothesis. During that period, Laura Whittaker continued to defend her father resolutely. Although summoned for interviews multiple times, she never changed her account of what had occurred in State College or of Richard's schedule. Each time she was asked whether her father could have left the hotel during the night, Laura answered that she did not know. But she did not believe he was involved in her mother's disappearance. Emily Whittaker, then only 14, could still recount only what she remembered. The argument between her mother and Laura, her sister, waking her to leave the house near dawn, and the fact that she had not seen her mother before departing. Emily could provide no additional information that would fill the gaps in the case. A few months later, Richard Whittaker decided to leave York with his daughters. He moved to the Lancaster area to begin a new job after the California interview proved unsuccessful. At the same time, through his attorney, Richard continued to file petitions with the York County Court seeking temporary suspension of alimony obligations on the grounds that Eleanor had been missing with unknown whereabouts, and requesting formal confirmation of legal custody of Emily. Although many legal procedures had to wait the prescribed time, Eleanor's continued absence gradually allowed Richard to obtain the things he had pursued for many years. In contrast to Richard, Mrs. Helen Carter resolutely refused to accept that her daughter was dead. When authorities explained the legal procedures related to a prolonged missing person case, she only shook her head quietly. I will not sign any paper declaring Eleanor dead, Helen told Callahan. When you bring my child back to me, then we can talk about that. For the elderly mother, as long as her daughter had not been found, hope remained. By the end of 1980, according to the York Police Department's archival procedures, the evidence boxes from the Eleanor Whittaker case were successively sealed and transferred to storage. Inside the carefully numbered cardboard cartons were the trunk liner from Richard's vehicle, the cream-colored fabric fiber recovered from the cargo area, the nylon rope, the Type A blood sample, hundreds of crime scene photographs, Laura Whittaker's statement transcripts, the guest registration ledger from the Nittany Lion Inn, and thousands of pages of other investigative documents. The file bearing the name Eleanor Whittaker was never formally closed, but from that point forward it was no longer an active investigation. It became an unsolved disappearance, lying quietly on the steel shelves in the York Police Department evidence warehouse, waiting for a new lead to appear someday in the future. The years that followed passed in almost absolute silence. Each summer, the posters seeking Eleanor Whittaker faded a little more under the Pennsylvania sun. The sheets of paper that had once been taped to utility poles, church bulletin boards, supermarket windows, and Greyhound terminals gradually curled at the edges, lost their color, and disappeared one by one as they were replaced by newer notices. Only a few old photographs in the Carter family's drawers and the thick files in the York Police Department archives remained to remind people that a woman had once vanished without a trace at the end of the summer of 1979. Lieutenant Thomas Callahan never truly abandoned the case. Even after the investigative team was disbanded and he had to take on many new cases, every few months he would take the evidence box, numbered 79-1846, down from the steel shelf in the storage room. He reread every statement, examined every crime scene photograph, recompared Richard Whittaker's timeline, studied the map of the route from State College to York, and hoped he would notice a detail he had previously overlooked. Occasionally a new tip would appear, but just as in the early years, all of them led to dead ends. There were no new witnesses. There was no body. There was no forensic technology advanced enough to turn the faint traces of 1979 into definitive evidence. In 1992, as he prepared to retire after more than 30 years of service with the York Police Department, Callahan devoted nearly an entire final workday solely to reviewing the Eleanor Whitaker file. He sat alone in the old office, turned each page of the documents once more, then took a pen and wrote a brief note on the inside cover of the file for any investigator who might reopen the case in the future. Start again with Laura. She knows more than she has said. Callahan had no proof that Laura had lied, but his professional instinct never left him. He always believed the 19-year-old daughter of that year had concealed part of the truth, whether to protect her father, protect her sister, or protect herself. Not long after Callahan retired, Mrs. Helen Carter also passed away at the age of 79. For the remainder of her life, she kept a photograph of Eleanor on the table beside her bed and refused to complete the paperwork declaring her daughter dead. Before she died, Helen told Susan that she still believed Eleanor was somewhere and that one day she would return. That never happened. Susan Whitaker and Emily Whitaker entered adulthood with an emptiness that could not be filled. There was no explanation, no funeral, and no place to lay memorial flowers. Over time, both gradually accepted the explanation Richard had always repeated. Their mother had simply left. Susan tried not to mention Eleanor any longer, while Emily grew up with the feeling of having been abandoned, always wondering why her mother could leave her without saying a word. Only Laura Whitaker lived differently. After graduating from college, she moved to Pittsburgh to work and later married. Yet those close to her noticed that Laura rarely spoke of her youth in York. Whenever anyone asked about her mother, she quickly changed the subject. There were nights when Laura stayed awake, remembering the final argument with Eleanor and what had happened afterward. A quiet sense of guilt followed her for many years, but she kept her secret. Meanwhile, Richard Whitaker left York and settled in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, gradually building an entirely new life. With his years of experience in the mechanical field, he was appointed to a senior engineering position at a large local manufacturing company. Richard regularly attended Sunday services at First Presbyterian Church of Lancaster, served on the church board of trustees, and frequently contributed to scholarship programs for engineering students. New neighbors remembered him as a courteous, punctual man who was always ready to help others with repairs around the neighborhood. Local newspapers repeatedly mentioned Richard as a supporter of educational and charitable activities. No one in the new community knew that years earlier he had been the primary suspect in a high-profile disappearance in York. Time continued to pass. The investigators who had worked the case successively retired or died. Witnesses grew older, memories gradually faded, and many documents were transferred from active filing cabinets to long-term storage. Under York Police Department regulations, the Eleanor Whitaker file was eventually transferred to the unit responsible for unsolved cases. On the file label, a new line appeared in red ink: Cold Case. From that point, the disappearance of Eleanor Whitaker was no longer an active investigation, but officially became a cold case, lying quietly among hundreds of others, waiting for the day a new investigator would open it and begin again from the beginning. 38 years passed since the afternoon Eleanor Whitaker disappeared from the house on East Market Street, yet the case still left wounds that no one in the family had truly overcome. Each person lived differently, carrying a different memory of that final night. For Emily Whitaker, the memories of age 14 had never been complete. Many times in later conversations with psychological specialists, she said she remembered only a few fragmented images, like pieces of film that had been cut apart. She remembered her mother repeatedly calling Laura's name from upstairs in a voice that was both angry and desperate. She remembered the sound of the argument drifting down the stairs in the dark night, even though she no longer recalled the specific words. She remembered Laura gently shaking her awake on the sofa and saying, "Emily, get up. We have to leave right now." She remembered the two sisters stepping outside while it was still dark, the late August chill covering the quiet street. She remembered sitting in the passenger seat of the car Laura drove back to State College, so tired and bewildered that she fell asleep for nearly the entire journey. And the last thing Emily always remembered clearly was the next morning, When she walked into the restaurant at the Nittany Lion Inn and saw Richard Whittaker already seated at the table with a cup of coffee in his hand, as if everything were proceeding normally. Beyond those images, Emily's memory was only empty space. Susan Whittaker chose a different way of confronting the past. After reaching adulthood, she gradually distanced herself from the entire family. Susan rarely mentioned her mother, and seldom saw her father or two younger sisters. Friends said that whenever anyone asked about her childhood in York, Susan always found a way to change the subject. For her, not speaking of Eleanor seemed the only way to continue living. The person most heavily affected was Laura Whittaker. After leaving York, Laura lived quietly, avoided contact with the media, and spoke very little about the past. According to a close friend later, Laura frequently woke in the middle of the night from recurring nightmares. Once she burst into tears and said in her sleep, "I'm sorry, Mom." Many of Laura's romantic relationships ended quickly. She devoted almost all her time to work, lived withdrawn, and rarely allowed anyone to enter too deeply into her private life. No one knew exactly what caused her to carry that sense of guilt for so many decades, but those close to her all recognized that Laura had never truly found peace. Meanwhile, Richard Whittaker continued to control the way his daughters viewed their mother. Whenever Eleanor was mentioned, he repeated the same story. According to Richard, Eleanor was a selfish mother who had chosen to leave rather than face her responsibilities. He told the children that she wanted to start a new life and no longer cared about the family. Over many years, that story gradually became something Emily and Susan accepted as truth because they had no other explanation. Every anniversary or 10th anniversary of Eleanor's disappearance, a few local newspapers such as the York Daily Record or the Patriot News would publish articles recalling the unsolved case. Reporters repeatedly contacted Richard for interviews, but he always declined. Once he answered briefly by telephone. "There's nothing left to say. Eleanor chose her own life." Then he hung up and never commented again. The case gradually faded from public memory, yet it remained intact in the archives of law enforcement. In early 2017, the Pennsylvania State Police launched a program to re-examine long-standing unsolved missing person cases using more modern investigative methods and forensic techniques. Hundreds of old files were transferred to the state's cold case unit for fresh evaluation. One of them was the file bearing the name Eleanor Whittaker. The detective assigned to study the case was Detective Rachel Monroe, 42 years old, who had previously investigated many complex cold cases. For several consecutive days, Rachel sat in the archives reading every page of the old file, from the faded crime scene photographs to the statement transcripts typed on yellowed paper. The more she read, the more she felt that something about this case had never been properly understood. Three details particularly caught Rachel's attention. First, when she placed Richard Whittaker's statement next to Laura Whittaker's statement, she noticed many passages that were nearly identical, not only in content but also in word choice, and the sequence in which events were recounted. "This does not look like two people remembering the same event," Rachel noted in the margin of the file. "It looks like two people telling the same pre-prepared story." The second detail was the type of blood sample recovered from the cargo area of Richard's Ford station wagon. In 1979, forensic technology could determine only blood type. But by 2017, if the sample had been properly preserved, modern DNA technology could fully identify the person who left the trace. Rachel marked the evidence item in red and added the note, "Check for possible remaining DNA." The final detail concerned Richard's timeline. Rachel used a modern electronic map to recalculate the distance between State College and York, then compared it with the time points in the file. The result showed that the period during which Richard was not seen at the Nittany Lion Inn was entirely sufficient for him to drive to York, return to the hotel before dawn, and still appear on time for breakfast with Laura and Emily. The alibi that investigators in 1979 had considered fairly solid had in fact never been completely verified. After closing the nearly 40-year-old file, Rachel Monroe walked into her supervisor's office with a memorandum in hand. "I want to reopen the Eleanor Whittaker case," she said. "I believe this file still has a chance of finding the truth." In early spring of 2017, after the Eleanor Whittaker file was officially reopened, Detective Rachel Monroe began reviewing all physical evidence still stored in the Pennsylvania State Police warehouse. What surprised her was that most of the samples from 1979 remained reasonably well sealed. The cardboard boxes that had darkened with age were transferred to the Pennsylvania State Police Forensic Laboratory in Harrisburg for re-evaluation with modern technology. 40 years ago, they did everything they were capable of, forensic expert Dr. Michael Brennan told Rachel. Now we have tools they never had. The first item unsealed was the cargo area carpet liner taken from Richard Whittaker's Ford Ltd. Country Squire. The reddish-brown bloodstain that in 1979 had been identified only as type A was sampled in a very small portion for DNA extraction. Next was a fine hair caught under the liner of the cargo area that the crime scene technicians at the time had collected but could not analyze because the root was no longer intact. The third item was the cream-colored fabric fiber found in the trunk. Then came the white nylon rope recovered from Richard's vehicle and the similar rope recovered from under the stairs at Eleanor's house. Finally, Rachel requested the reopening of an item of evidence that had been almost forgotten for decades, a gray blanket that had been seized from the cargo area of the station wagon. In 1979, investigators had merely noted that the blanket showed no unusual signs, so it was placed in storage without further analysis. This time, the experts employed multiple DNA testing methods, biological trace analysis, and reagents designed to detect washed blood. For several weeks, Rachel telephoned the laboratory almost every day to inquire about progress. In early June 2017, Dr. Brennan invited her to come in person to review the results. The first report silenced the entire investigative room. The DNA sample recovered from the blood stain on the cargo area carpet matched the reference samples taken from Susan Whittaker and Emily Whittaker, identifying the person who left the blood as Eleanor Whittaker, with near absolute probability according to modern forensic standards. Rachel stared at the conclusion and asked again, "It's no longer just type A?" Brennan shook his head. "No, this is complete nuclear DNA. The blood stain in the trunk belongs to Eleanor." The second result concerned the hair. Although the nuclear DNA had degraded over time, the experts were still able to extract mitochondrial DNA and compare it with samples from Susan and Emily. The report concluded that the hair's mitochondrial DNA was consistent with Eleanor Whittaker's maternal line. Brennan explained, "Mitochondrial DNA cannot identify an individual with absolute certainty, but it is consistent with Eleanor's maternal lineage and excludes the majority of the population." Next came the results from the nylon rope. Very small areas that still retained epithelial cells on the surface of the rope were analyzed with mixed DNA techniques. The report showed that biological traces of both Eleanor Whittaker and Richard Whittaker were present on the rope. Rachel recognized this as an important finding but also immediately understood its legal limitations. The two had once been husband and wife and had shared many objects for years. So the presence of both individuals' DNA on the same piece of rope was not sufficient to prove the rope had been used in the crime. The final noteworthy discovery came from the gray blanket. After treatment with luminescent reagents and modern imaging techniques, the laboratory detected a region approximately 30 centimeters wide that had once been soaked with blood but had been thoroughly cleaned. The DNA sample recovered from that area also identified Eleanor Whittaker. Rachel stared silently at the green fluorescence appearing on the computer screen. "Someone tried hard to clean this blanket," Brennan said. "But today's technology still detects the residual blood." Nevertheless, when Rachel and Assistant District Attorney Daniel Mercer evaluated the entire set of results, both understood that the defense still had many arguments available. Richard could easily claim that Eleanor had ridden in the vehicle many times while they were still living together, had used that blanket on family trips, and had handled the nylon rope. The DNA evidence proved Eleanor had been present in the vehicle, but it did not prove when or under what circumstances. Rachel, therefore, did not stop at the forensic evidence. She decided to digitize the entire more than 3,000 pages of the 1979 investigative file in order to search for details that had previously been overlooked. For several consecutive days, every transcript, every receipt, every handwritten note was scanned into the system and reorganized chronologically. It was during this process that Rachel discovered an error that seemed very minor, yet could change the entire direction of the investigation. Wedged incorrectly between the forensic test file and the crime scene examination report was a gas station receipt that had yellowed with age. This document had never been mentioned in any summary report. Rachel took a magnifying glass and read every faded line. The receipt had been printed at 2:56 a.m. on August 26, 1979, at a gas station on U.S. Route 30 near the town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Payment was made in cash. No customer name was recorded because it was a direct counter transaction. Rachel immediately opened a 1979 road map. From State College to Gettysburg and then back toward York was not the ordinary route to Harrisburg International Airport. More importantly, Richard Whittaker had never mentioned being in Gettysburg in any of his statements. She used a red pen to connect the points on the map and realized a detail that forced her to stop. From that gas station, if one continued southwest instead of returning toward Harrisburg, the road led straight into Michaud State Forest, a forest spanning tens of thousands of acres with countless forestry roads, ravines, and remote areas almost devoid of human traffic. Rachel closed the file, looked for a long time at the map in front of her, and said quietly to herself, "Perhaps. We have been looking in the wrong place for nearly 40 years. By mid-2018, after the new DNA results had been completed and the gas station receipt near Gettysburg had been discovered in the old file, York County Assistant District Attorney Daniel Mercer agreed that the case had entered an entirely different phase. Nevertheless, he also reminded Detective Rachel Monroe that the new evidence was still insufficient to prosecute Richard Whittaker for murder. "We can prove Eleanor bled inside Richard's vehicle," Mercer said during a meeting at the district attorney's office. "But we still cannot prove where she died, how she died, or who caused it. To go further, we need their own words." After reviewing the file and the new forensic evidence, Mercer obtained a court order authorizing an investigative tactic that detectives still call tickle the wire, deliberately applying psychological pressure by letting the suspect believe police have made a breakthrough, then monitoring lawful communications among the people involved in search of incriminating statements. Rachel was assigned to approach Laura Whittaker first, because as early as 1992, Thomas Callahan had left the note that every answer should begin with her. On the afternoon of July 18, 2018, Rachel dialed Laura's telephone number. After several rings, a cautious, middle-aged female voice answered. "Laura Whittaker speaking." Rachel calmly introduced herself. "This is Detective Rachel Monroe of the Pennsylvania State Police Cold Case Unit. We are re-examining the disappearance of your mother." The other end of the line went silent at once. Rachel continued in a measured tone. "I want you to know in advance that we have just completed retesting Richard Whittaker's Ford station wagon with modern DNA technology. In addition, we also have a new witness concerning the events of the weekend of August 25 and 26, 1979. In reality, Rachel was not lying. The DNA testing was genuine. The phrase "new witness" was simply a way of referring to a document and certain information recently found in the old file. She continued, "I need you to come to our office this week to clarify several points in your 1979 statement." Laura drew a sharp breath. Do I need a lawyer?" Rachel answered very evenly. "That is entirely your decision. At present, we only want to talk." The call ended in less than 4 minutes. Exactly as Rachel had predicted. Less than 10 minutes later, Laura immediately telephoned Richard Whittaker. The call was conducted within the scope of the court-authorized monitoring order. When the recording was delivered to the investigative office, Rachel, Daniel Mercer, and 2 other detectives sat together and listened to every sentence. Richard answered on the second ring. "What's going on, Laura?" Laura's voice was clearly trembling. "Dad, the police called me. They said they retested the car and have a new witness. They want me to come in and talk." Richard was silent for a few seconds, then spoke in a very calm voice, identical to the way he had once answered Thomas Callahan nearly 40 years earlier. "Don't panic. First of all, you are not to speak with them without a lawyer," Laura asked quietly. "But what if they know something?" Richard replied at once. "They always say that to apply pressure. Just stay calm." After a few seconds, he added a sentence that made Rachel immediately look up at Mercer. "Just stick to the story we have told from the beginning." In the listening room, no one said a word. Rachel rewound the recording and listened again. "Richard did not say the story you told or your statement. He said very clearly, The story we have told. That phrasing implied both of them shared a single version of events that had been agreed upon in advance. The conversation continued. Richard asked, "They said they retested the car?" "Yes." "Did they say they found anything?" "No." Richard thought, then asked further, "Do you still remember exactly what the police took from the car that year? Did they take everything or only a few items?" Laura answered that she did not remember clearly, only that the police had examined the vehicle for a long time. Richard offered no further comment and simply instructed, "Don't guess. If you don't remember, say you don't remember." Rachel immediately noted that question in her notebook. After nearly 40 years, the first thing Richard was concerned about was not the new witness or why the police had reopened the file, but the items of evidence that had been seized from the vehicle. That fact further convinced the investigators that he knew precisely what had once been inside the car. At the end of the call, Laura was nearly in tears. "Dad, what if they find Mom?" Richard answered in a very low but distinct voice, "After all these years, they cannot prove your mother is dead." The entire listening room fell silent. Rachel pressed the stop button on the recording. Daniel Mercer slowly removed his glasses and looked at the detectives. For nearly 40 years, whenever asked about Eleanor Whitaker, Richard had always insisted she had left of her own accord, that she had voluntarily abandoned the family to begin a new life. That was the story he had steadfastly maintained before the police, before the press, and before his own children. But in this call, Richard did not say, "They cannot prove your mother did not leave." He also did not mention that Eleanor was still alive somewhere, as he had always claimed. Instead, Richard chose an entirely different formulation. "They cannot prove your mother is dead." To Rachel Monroe, that was not a slip of the tongue. It was the first time in nearly 4 decades that Richard Whitaker had unintentionally shifted the focus from denying criminal conduct to acknowledging the central issue of the investigation: Eleanor's death. The statement was not enough to constitute a courtroom confession, yet it completely shattered the narrative Richard had sustained for 38 years and became the first serious mistake he had made since the night Eleanor Whitaker disappeared. On the morning of January 24, 2018, as the sun was just rising over the city of Lancaster, 2 Pennsylvania State Police investigative teams simultaneously launched the most critical phase since the Eleanor Whitaker file had been reopened. According to the plan devised by Detective Rachel Monroe and Assistant District Attorney Daniel Mercer, Richard Whitaker and Laura Whitaker would be completely separated so they could not communicate with each other. At precisely 8:05 a.m., investigator David Collins and Sergeant Eric Nolan approached Richard at the house where he was living in Lancaster. At the same moment, nearly 300 miles away, Rachel Monroe and investigator Sarah Jennings walked into the office where Laura worked in Pittsburgh. The 2 interviews were conducted almost simultaneously. Richard agreed to go to the station with his attorney. Laura also agreed to accompany the investigators to the state police office in Pittsburgh. In the interview room in Lancaster, Richard Whitaker, now in his 80s, still maintained his familiar composed demeanor. When Collins said the investigation into Eleanor's disappearance had been reopened, Richard merely replied calmly, "I answered all these questions 40 years ago." He continued to assert that Eleanor had left voluntarily, denied any involvement in his ex-wife's disappearance, and repeated his schedule in State College and the flight to California. Meanwhile, in Pittsburgh, Laura Whitaker sat across from Rachel Monroe with her hands tightly clasped together. When asked about the weekend of August 25 and 26, 1979, she almost repeated word for word the statement she had given in the 58-page transcript years earlier. "My father helped me move things into the apartment. He stayed at the hotel. The next morning we had breakfast with Emily. I don't know what happened to my mother." Rachel did not interrupt. She let Laura finish speaking, then gently opened the gray file folder on the table. "Laura, before you continue, I want you to look at a few things." The first document Rachel placed down was the 2017 DNA report. She slid the papers toward Laura. "The blood in the trunk of your father's Ford station wagon belongs to Eleanor Whitaker." Laura bent her head and read the first few lines. Her hands began to tremble slightly, yet she still said nothing. Rachel next placed on the table a copy of the gas station receipt timed at 2:56 a.m. near Gettysburg. Your father never mentioned this trip. After that came the map with the route from State College through Gettysburg and toward Michaud State Forest marked in red ink. Laura remained silent. Rachel took out another set of papers. This is the recording of the telephone call between you and Richard Whitaker after I contacted you last year. Laura immediately looked up. Rachel did not read the entire transcript. She only pointed to a passage that had been highlighted in yellow. Just stick to the story we have told. The room sank into silence. Rachel opened the final document. It was a photocopy of the note Thomas Callahan had left before retiring. The handwriting had faded but was still legible. Start again with Laura. She knows more than she has said. Rachel closed the folder and looked straight at Laura. One detective carried this secret with him for 25 years. I think he was right. No one spoke for nearly a minute. The ticking of the wall clock became unusually loud. Laura lowered her head. The first tears fell onto the papers in front of her. I can't carry this any longer. Her voice was almost inaudible. Rachel did not press. She simply placed a box of tissues gently in front of Laura. After several minutes of struggling to regain composure, Laura began to speak in a broken voice. She said that approximately 1 week before Eleanor disappeared, Richard had sought her out privately at State College. He told her his financial situation had reached its limit. Dad said he could not continue paying Mother. He said if everything continued, he would lose the house, lose his job, and eventually lose the children as well. Laura paused for a very long time before continuing. Dad said there were only 2 choices left. Either he ended his own life, or Mother had to disappear. Rachel took notes but did not interrupt. Laura recounted that at first she thought her father was speaking only out of despair. On the evening of August 25, 1979, while she and Emily were at Eleanor's house, Richard suddenly appeared behind the house, according to the plan he had previously outlined. Around midnight, Dad knocked very lightly on the back door. I was the one who opened it. Laura broke into sobs. If I hadn't opened the door then, she could not finish the sentence. According to Laura, Richard stepped inside very quickly and told her to stay on the first floor. He went straight up the stairs to Eleanor's bedroom. A few minutes later, Laura heard the 2 of them arguing. At first, it was only quiet conversation, then Eleanor's voice grew louder. She remembered her mother saying, "You will never get Emily." Richard replied, something she could no longer recall clearly. Then suddenly every sound stopped completely. The silence was terrifying. Laura said she stood motionless at the foot of the stairs for about a minute and then ran upstairs. When she entered the bedroom, she saw Eleanor lying motionless on the floor beside the bed. Richard was kneeling next to her. I screamed and asked what was wrong with Mom. Laura choked. Dad looked at me and said, "Your mother just fainted. We have to take her away." Rachel asked very softly, "Did you believe him at that moment?" Laura shook her head through her tears. I wanted to believe. I forced myself to believe. According to Laura's statement, Richard continually urged her to help. He pulled the gray blanket from the foot of the bed, covered Eleanor with it, and told Laura to hold one end. Father and daughter wrapped Eleanor in the blanket, dragged her out of the bedroom, down the stairs 1 step at a time, and out the back door. Mom didn't say anything, and she didn't move. Laura's voice caught. Outside, the dark blue Ford station wagon was already parked in the darkness. Richard opened the rear cargo area. Father and daughter together lifted Eleanor into it, then Richard closed the trunk lid. Dad told me to go back inside the house right away. Laura recounted that afterward Richard told her she had to take Emily out of York before daylight as planned. He said Emily must not see anything. Laura woke her younger sister, who was sleeping on the sofa, drove straight to State College, and the next morning met Richard for breakfast at the Nittany Lion Inn with Emily in order to create the appearance that everything was normal. Rachel asked the final question. "Did your father say where he had taken Eleanor?" Laura shook her head in despair. "No, I never knew. I only know that when Dad drove the car away from the house that night. That was the last time I ever saw my mother." After Laura Whitaker's detailed statement, the investigation for the first time in nearly 40 years had a concrete direction of search rather than relying solely on hypothesis. Detective Rachel Monroe and Assistant District Attorney Daniel Mercer began cross-checking every detail Laura provided against the old documents in the file. The gas station re-site timed at 2:56 a.m. on August 26, 1979, near Gettysburg was no longer an isolated piece of evidence. It matched the period during which Richard Whittaker had vanished from the Nittany Lion Inn and also fit the route leading to Michaud State Forest, a national forest of more than 85,000 acres lying between Adams, Cumberland, and Franklin counties. Rachel continued reviewing Richard's old employment records and discovered a document that had never previously been noticed. While working as a mechanical engineer for York Corporation in the early 1970s, Richard had participated in a project installing and maintaining equipment for a logging station located on the eastern edge of Michaud State Forest. Company records showed he had visited the area many times over nearly 2 years and was familiar with the system of forestry roads known to very few people. If someone needed a place remote enough that no one would discover it for decades, Rachel said to Mercer while pointing at the map, he would choose a place he already knew thoroughly. In early March 2018, the Pennsylvania State Police, in coordination with the State Bureau of Forestry, launched a large-scale search operation in Michaud State Forest. Unlike the searches of 1979, this time the investigative force brought modern equipment. A team of geophysical specialists used ground-penetrating radar to scan areas showing signs of previously disturbed soil. 2 cadaver dog teams followed the scent from items that had once belonged to Eleanor. Cartographic experts overlaid historical aerial photographs of the forest taken in the late 1970s with modern satellite imagery to identify long-abandoned logging roads. Rachel also requested the use of the 1978 topographic maps of the Pennsylvania Bureau of Forestry in order to pinpoint the exact routes Richard might have used when the area still saw logging traffic. The search continued for many days in freezing weather. Dozens of suspicious depressions were examined, but none produced results. On the 6th day, one of the 2 cadaver dogs, named Ranger, suddenly stopped on a low hillside near the location of an old logging road that had been almost completely overgrown by trees. The dog continually scratched at the ground and barked loudly. When the radar team rescanned the area, the screen displayed a region of soil whose structure differed from the surrounding matrix. An oval shape roughly 2 meters long and less than 1 meter deep. This could be a shallow burial pit, the geophysical specialist said. Rachel immediately obtained a warrant to excavate the site. Each layer of earth was removed with archaeological tools to avoid damaging evidence. After a little more than an hour, investigator Sarah Jennings discovered the first fragment of bone. Not long afterward, the entire team worked in absolute silence as the form of a human skeleton gradually emerged beneath the red soil that had been compacted for nearly 40 years. The excavation continued until the end of the day. Beside the remains, the specialists recovered several surviving items of evidence. 2 ivory-colored buttons lay near the chest area. A gold wedding band remained on the ring finger of the left hand. Near the hip was a portion of a metal belt buckle that had rusted. Investigators also found a length of white nylon rope lying against the cervical vertebrae and numerous fragments of decayed fabric. Among them, 1 piece of cream-colored floral cloth still retained a relatively intact fiber structure. Rachel immediately recalled the description in the 1979 file. Eleanor had been wearing a cream-colored floral nightgown on the last night she was seen alive. All the evidence was sealed and transferred at once to the laboratory. 1 week later, the DNA results from the femur were compared with samples Srusun and Emily Whittaker. The report concluded that the remains belonged to Eleanor Whittaker, with a kinship probability that met forensic identification standards. After 38 years, the missing woman had finally been found. The forensic examination continued to yield an even more important conclusion. Although most soft tissue had long since decomposed, forensic anthropologists discovered a fractured hyoid bone together with multiple injuries to the upper cervical vertebrae. According to Dr. Michael Brennan, this pattern of trauma was consistent with the victim having been strangled with significant force before death. The nylon rope recovered from the burial pit was determined to share characteristics with the type of rope previously seized from Richard Whittaker's Ford station wagon and the length of rope taken from under the stairs at Eleanor's house in 1979. The decayed fabric fragments were also determined to match in structure and pattern the gown described in the crime scene photographs and in Laura's statement. When Rachel Monroe stepped out of the meeting room that afternoon, she looked at the evidence summary board that had been updated for the first time in nearly 4 decades. The case was no longer based solely on suspicion. Police now possessed the body of Eleanor Whitaker, a cause of death consistent with strangulation, Laura Whitaker's direct statement about assisting in concealing the crime scene, DNA evidence linking Eleanor to Richard's vehicle, financial motive and the custody dispute, and a reconstructed transportation route derived from the gas station receipt, employment records, and the location of the burial pit in Michaud State Forest. Rachel placed the file in front of Assistant District Attorney Daniel Mercer. He read each page slowly, signed the final recommendation, then looked up and said, "It is time to end this case." On the afternoon of March 16, 2018, a York County judge signed an arrest warrant for Richard Whitaker, charging him with murder, concealment of a corpse, and obstruction of an investigation. After 38 years, the man who had lived peacefully under the guise of a respectable citizen finally had to face justice. The arrest warrant for Richard Whitaker was signed on the afternoon of March 16, 2018, but when investigators from the Pennsylvania State Police arrived at his house in Lancaster the following morning, they discovered that the 81-year-old man had left very early. The silver sedan that usually parked in front of the garage was gone. A neighbor living across the street said that around 5 o'clock in the morning, they had seen Richard drive away from the neighborhood alone. He did not answer his telephone and did not appear for the work appointment with investigators that his attorney had confirmed 2 days earlier. To Rachel Monroe, that was a clear sign that Richard understood the investigation was no longer limited to ordinary questions. "He knows we have Eleanor," Rachel said in the command room. "And he knows this time he cannot explain everything the way he did 40 years ago." Immediately, a task force, in coordination with the New Jersey State Police and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, began the search. Lawful location data from Richard's mobile telephone showed the final signal transmitted from Princeton, New Jersey, more than 2 hours' drive from Lancaster. An investigative team immediately moved to the downtown area. Around 11:20 a.m., a patrol officer discovered the silver sedan bearing Pennsylvania license plates parked on a lower level of a multi-story garage near Princeton Junction Station. Security cameras confirmed that Richard had walked up to the upper levels but had not come back down. Police quickly sealed off the entire area and deployed forces to approach. When officers reached the top level of the parking garage, they saw Richard Whitaker standing against the concrete railing at the outer edge. The early spring wind blew strongly across the rooftop. Richard had his back to everyone, both hands gripping the barrier, with more than 20 meters of empty space below. When an officer called his name, Richard did not turn around. He only said, "Don't come any closer, I'll jump." The response team immediately withdrew to a safe distance so that crisis negotiation specialists could approach. For more than 2 hours, continuous negotiations took place. Lieutenant Kevin Marshall of the Crisis Negotiation Unit tried to keep Richard talking, mentioning his daughters, his age, and the opportunity to present his case in court. Richard barely reacted. At times, he simply repeated, "Everything ended a long time ago." When Marshall said that the truth finally needed to come to light, Richard answered with a short sentence, "You people don't understand what happened." Nevertheless, he still refused to step away from the edge of the railing. While the negotiations continued, a state police team silently moved through the technical stairwell at the rear using the barrier walls to shorten the distance. At approximately 1:47 p.m., Richard suddenly turned his head toward the sound of a car horn rising from the street below. In that instant, a member of the Pennsylvania State Police Tactical Team lunged from behind, locked his arms around Richard's upper body, and pulled him down onto the concrete floor. 2 other officers immediately assisted in restraining both arms and applying handcuffs. The entire sequence lasted only a few seconds. Richard offered no resistance after being seized. He lay still on the cement, eyes tightly closed, and said nothing more. That same afternoon, Richard Whitaker was transported back to Pennsylvania. At the York County District Attorney's Office, Assistant District Attorney Daniel Mercer formally announced the charges, which included first-degree murder, criminal conspiracy, concealment of a corpse, obstruction of justice, and fabrication and concealment of evidence for the purpose of misleading the investigation. Mercer emphasized that the decision to prosecute had been made after investigators obtained Laura Whitaker's statement, DNA results, forensic evidence from Michaud State Forest, and numerous new documents discovered during the review of the cold case file. Only a few hours after the information was released, the news spread throughout Lancaster. Local television stations interrupted regular programming to report the arrest of the man the community had known as an exemplary retired engineer. Outside Richard's house, television trucks lined up one after another. Neighbors could not hide their astonishment. One person who had lived in the same neighborhood for more than 10 years told a reporter that Richard had always mowed the lawn for elderly families and had never shown a temper. A member of First Presbyterian Church of Lancaster was choked with emotion upon learning that the man who had sat on the church board of trustees was accused of murdering his own ex-wife and concealing the truth for nearly 40 years. Former colleagues at the engineering firm where Richard had worked also expressed shock. They remembered him as punctual, dedicated, and a frequent contributor to scholarship funds for mechanical engineering students. No one in the new community knew that behind the image of a model citizen lay an unsolved disappearance dating from 1979. At the same time, the district attorney's office also announced the decision to charge Laura Whitaker with assisting in the concealment of a crime and obstructing the investigation after she learned her mother had been removed from the scene. However, at the press conference, Daniel Mercer emphasized that the prosecution would fully consider Laura's special circumstances. When the events occurred, she was only 19 years old, Mercer said. According to the evidence currently available, Laura was subjected to prolonged psychological domination and manipulation by her father. That does not erase legal responsibility, but it is an important factor when assessing the degree of the defendant's culpability. Rachel Monroe stood at the back of the press room, quietly watching the reporters continuously ask questions about the man who had hidden a secret for nearly 4 decades. The cold case investigation had finally brought Richard Whitaker before justice, yet for Rachel the most important stage still lay ahead, proving to a jury that the pieces collected over nearly 40 years were sufficient to accurately recount what had happened to Eleanor Whitaker on the night she disappeared. After Richard Whitaker's arrest, the York County District Attorney's Office entered the preparation phase for what was regarded as one of the most significant cold case trials in many years. Pennsylvania. Assistant District Attorney Daniel Mercer assembled a specialized team consisting of investigators, forensic experts, DNA specialists, and psychological consultants to review the entire file before bringing the case to court. On the wall of the conference room, Mercer had a nearly 5-meter-long timeline posted, connecting every piece of evidence in sequence from the night of August 25, 1979, to the day the remains were excavated at Michaud State Forest. He wanted to ensure that a jury could see the complete picture rather than isolated fragments. The evidence inventory was finalized after many months of preparation. First was the DNA result identifying the blood in the cargo area of the Ford station wagon as belonging to Eleanor Whitaker. Next were the remains excavated at Michaud State Forest, together with the forensic conclusion establishing a cause of death consistent with strangulation. The nylon rope found in the burial pit was compared with the type of rope seized from Richard's vehicle and from under the stairs at Eleanor's house. The gas station receipt timed at 2:56 a.m. near Gettysburg became the link, proving that Richard had left the route he had described to police in 1979. Prosecutors also included in the file Laura Whitaker's complete statement, the recording of the telephone call in which Richard said, "Just stick to the story we have told, and after all these years they cannot prove your mother is dead." In addition, there were financial records showing Richard was drowning in debt, facing the risk of losing his house, obligated to pay substantial alimony to Eleanor, and engaged in a multi-year custody dispute over Emily before the crime occurred. Close friends of Eleanor, including Diane Foster and many colleagues at York College, also agreed to testify that Eleanor had never intended to abandon her children, was planning to sell the house, continue teaching, and begin a stable life after gaining an advantage in the custody case. According to Daniel Mercer, the entire body of evidence not only demonstrated that Richard had both opportunity and motive, but also clearly proved that he had deliberately staged a disappearance to conceal a murder. However, the defense quickly constructed an aggressive counter-strategy. Defense counsel argued that Laura Whitaker had changed her statement after nearly 40 years solely to obtain a favorable agreement for herself. He contended that the memory of any witness after 38 years was no longer reliable and was easily influenced by media, investigators, or feelings of guilt. Counsel also emphasized that finding Eleanor's DNA in the vehicle of the man who had once been her husband was not unusual because the two had lived together for many years. He continued to advance the hypothesis that Eleanor might have left the house with Richard, then encountered someone else and been murdered elsewhere, before the body was taken to Michaud State Forest. Another line of attack focused on the 1979 evidence preservation process. Counsel pointed out that many samples had been stored for decades, had undergone multiple transfers and changes of storage facilities, thereby questioning the integrity of the chain of custody. Daniel Mercer was prepared for these arguments. He called every storage technician, every forensic expert, and even retired investigators to confirm that the entire process of sealing, storage, and unsealing had been fully documented according to Pennsylvania state regulations. Meanwhile, Laura Whitaker, through her attorney, agreed to sign a plea agreement accepting responsibility for the crimes of obstruction of justice and assisting in the concealment of a crime after the fact, in exchange for providing a complete, truthful account and withholding no detail related to Eleanor's death. Mercer stressed that this was not an exemption from responsibility, but a necessary decision in order to bring the full truth to light. At the hearing, Laura stepped onto the witness stand with a tense expression. After taking the oath, she needed nearly a minute before she could answer the first question. In a choked voice, Laura recounted that for many years before Eleanor disappeared, Richard had continually told the children that their mother was selfish, unstable, and trying to destroy the family. He often said Eleanor would cause the entire household to lose everything, that if she obtained custody of Emily, the children would no longer be able to see their father. "Dad made me believe that Mother was a threat to the family," Laura said through tears. "He said if Mother won, all of us would lose one another." Laura admitted that at 19 she both feared her father and depended on him completely for emotional support. After the night Eleanor disappeared, Richard repeatedly reminded her that if she told the truth, the entire family would fall apart, Emily would lose her father, and Laura herself would be regarded as an accomplice in the murder of her mother. "I believed I had no choice," she sobbed. "I did the wrong thing and have had to live with it for nearly 40 years. Daniel Mercer then spent considerable time explaining to the court the phenomenon of parental alienation, the situation in which one parent continuously manipulates the children's psychology so that they turn against the other parent. He emphasized that this phenomenon was not a basis for erasing Laura's legal responsibility for the action she had taken after the night of the crime. However, it helped explain why a 19-year-old girl accepted her father's instructions, participated in constructing an alibi, and remained silent for decades. Mercer argued that Richard had not only murdered Eleanor, but had also turned his own daughter into an instrument for concealing the crime. As the pretrial exchange of evidence neared completion, Richard's attorney realized that the prosecution's file far exceeded what they had initially anticipated. DNA linked Eleanor to the vehicle, the remains and cause of death had been established, Laura's statement matched the crime scene, the gas station receipt matched the route to Michaud State Forest, and the telephone recording showed that Richard and Laura had maintained a unified story for many years. After multiple rounds of negotiation with the district attorney's office, Richard Whitaker decided not to allow the case to proceed to a lengthy jury trial. In court, he agreed to plead guilty to first-degree murder pursuant to a plea agreement in order to avoid a full trial with dozens of witnesses and weeks of litigation. In the publicly read plea statement, Richard admitted that on the night of August 25, 1979, he had strangled Eleanor Whitaker after an argument over money and custody. He confirmed that together with Laura, he had wrapped Eleanor's body in the blanket, placed her in the cargo area of the Ford station wagon, driven to the Michaud State Forest area to bury the body, and thereafter used Laura and the schedule in State College to construct an alibi that sent the investigation in the wrong direction for nearly 40 years. When the final admissions were entered into the record, the secret Richard Whittaker had guarded for nearly 4 decades officially collapsed. Several weeks after Richard Whittaker formally entered his guilty plea, the York County Court convened the final sentencing hearing in the case that had spanned nearly 40 years. The courtroom was packed with reporters, investigators who had worked the case, former colleagues of Eleanor Whittaker at York College, and many citizens who had followed the cold case developments since the day it was reopened. Richard Whittaker, now in his 80s, entered the courtroom in dark prison clothing. Throughout the hearing, he displayed almost no emotion. After hearing the final presentations from both sides, Judge Harold Simmons rose to read the sentence. He pronounced Richard Whittaker guilty of first-degree murder, together with the related offenses of concealing a corpse, obstructing justice, and destroying evidence. The sentence imposed was life imprisonment, without the possibility of parole. Before concluding, the judge devoted several minutes to speaking about the consequences of the crime. He observed, "This crime not only took the life of Eleanor Whittaker, it also took nearly 40 years of truth from 3 daughters. It caused her children to grow up believing that their own mother had voluntarily abandoned them. It turned a 19-year-old girl into a participant in concealing a crime under the manipulation of her own father. And above all, it forced the victim's family to live nearly 4 decades in pain, hope, and then despair, while the person responsible continued to be regarded as a respectable citizen." The entire courtroom was silent as those words were entered into the official record. Regarding Laura Whittaker, the court accepted the plea agreement she had signed with the district attorney's office. The judge emphasized that Laura must bear responsibility for having helped conceal the crime and for having lied to investigators for many years. However, he also recognized 3 special mitigating factors. Laura had been only 19 at the time of the events. She had lived for years under her father's psychological manipulation and control, and she herself had cooperated with investigators, provided the statement that led to the discovery of Eleanor's remains, and brought the case to its conclusion. Therefore, Laura received a lighter sentence consistent with the agreement with the prosecutor, rather than facing a severe sentence like her father's. After the hearing, Susan Whittaker and Emily Whittaker appeared together before the media for the first time since the case was resolved. Emily said through tears that for nearly 40 years she had always wondered why her mother never called, never wrote, or never tried to contact the children. She had once been angry at Eleanor, had once believed her mother had chosen another life instead of the family. "Now I know Mother never left us," Emily said through tears. "That brings both peace and the greatest pain of my life." Susan also acknowledged the lingering guilt of having believed for so long the story Richard had constructed. The 2 sisters together placed a bouquet of white flowers before their mother's portrait at the first memorial service held after the remains were identified. Several weeks later, the remains of Eleanor Whittaker were interred at a cemetery in York, Pennsylvania, not far from where she had lived and taught. The ceremony was simple yet attended by family, old friends, investigators, and many colleagues from York College. For the first time since 1979, Eleanor had a resting place bearing her own name rather than existing only as an unsolved missing person file. York College later held a memorial service for Eleanor, recalling her contributions in the field of English literature teaching and affirming that she was always remembered by colleagues as a person devoted to her students. The college board decided to fully restore Eleanor's professional record and return her name to the roster of faculty who had served at the institution. That same year, with contributions from the family, alumni, and the local community, the Eleanor Whittaker Scholarship was established to support students studying literature and those participating in research programs on the prevention of domestic violence. For many people, it was not merely a scholarship, but a way for Eleanor's name to remain associated with education rather than solely with a criminal case. The case also produced numerous changes within Pennsylvania law enforcement circles. Investigative agencies used the Eleanor Whittaker file as a textbook example of coercive control, in which an abuser seeks not only to control a partner, but also to manipulate the children in service of the criminal conduct. Family law specialists emphasize the danger that abuse of custody dispute procedures can become a tool of pressure against victims in abusive relationships. The phenomenon of parental alienation was also incorporated into many training programs for investigators and child protection specialists as a factor requiring careful evaluation in domestic violence cases, because psychological manipulation can turn children or adult offspring into unconscious protectors of the very perpetrator. At the same time, the case prompted a review of evidence preservation procedures in long-term missing person investigations. If the samples from 1979 had not been carefully stored, modern DNA technology would never have had the opportunity to identify the blood in the vehicle, identify the remains, or connect the pieces of the case. The Eleanor Whitaker file also became a clear demonstration of the value of cold case units, where cases that seem buried by time can still be solved through the combination of new technology and the re-examination of old details from a different perspective. Ultimately, however, what closed the case was not solely DNA or forensic science. For nearly 40 years, Richard Whitaker had caused police, the press, the community, and even Eleanor's own children to believe that she had chosen to leave the family. The truth was the exact opposite. Eleanor never left. She was taken from her children's lives, murdered and buried in Michaud State Forest, together with a secret that her own family members had been forced by fear to keep. Modern technology reopened the file, but what truly broke the case was a brief note written by Lieutenant Thomas Callahan on the cover of the file decades before he retired. "Start again with Laura. She knows more than she has said." That very sentence led investigators to the last person still holding the key to the truth, and finally restored justice to Eleanor Whitaker after nearly 40 years of waiting. If you found this story meaningful, please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell to join us for the next Cold Case Files. Thank you for taking the time to watch to the end. See you in the next video.